morning, everyone. I realize that it's not even been 12 hours. I guess it's been 12 hours since the last stream. Last night I did an episode of One in Rome with my buddy Matt. We were doing a special on Robespierre and the Terror. And while it started off all right, I think that by the end it kind of derailed. I was trying to balance making sure that I was engaging with the chat and trying to make sure that we got through the actual content, but there was a lot to go through. And so what I figured I'd do is I'd actually start doing, since we're doing One in Rome on Wednesday nights, what I might do is do a French Revolution history discussion in the mornings, maybe on either Thursday or Friday after One in Rome. So we'll see if this video gets positive feedback and what have you. I'll be happy to do that. But one of the big things with understanding the French Revolution, and is where we're going to start here with today's discussion, is understanding Louis XVI. Last night we talked a bit about Robespierre, and eventually I'll get to, like, if we continue doing these, I'll go and I'll do another Robespierre video, because I feel like I got to do a pretty good job of establishing the initial timeline, but then I didn't really get a chance to actually talk too much about Robespierre because I was running out of time. And that's one of the difficulties with this, is that you go and you do your prep work and what have you, and you do what you got to do to get through the stream. But I was trying to keep it to about an hour, and I ran out of time. These things happen. So what we're going to do is today we're going to talk about Louis XVI, as the impromptu stream title is Unfit for the Throne. Now, this is actually going to be a pretty big theme throughout, obviously, Louis's reign, but even when it comes down to his trial. And a lot of the people in Louis's defense will absolutely agree with the fact that he committed all these things, but when it comes down to actually punishing him, the big defense against executing him is he was never fit to be on the throne to begin with, and a lot of people wanted to push for him to be exiled to the Americas, where he could be given like an allowance and could live out his days as a locksmith or clock worker. Like those are two things we'll get into here shortly. When it comes down to Louis, it's important to first establish kind of the basis of what he was brought into. So, and just as a thing, I know that there's no one in the chat right now. I'm sure that this will mainly be watched for replay. It's early in the morning, and I literally just posted this up to Twitter, so I'm not expecting anyone to show up. If they do, I'll obviously acknowledge you guys, and I'll bring up the chats, and I'll have some fun with it. But in the meantime, we're just going to talk. If somebody joins in, great. If not, not a big deal. But when it comes down to Louis, in order to understand his situation that would end up leading into the revolution, we kind of got to go back to his not predecessor, but one right before his God, I don't even know how many greats. Louis XIV, who had been the monarch back in the late 1600s. I want to say the late 1600s. Let me double check so I don't screw that up. Yeah, mid 1600s through the beginning of the 18th century in 1715. Louis XIV did a lot for France. But one of the big thing that he is known for is consolidating the power of the monarchy to an absolute state. He had moved the court from Paris and the Tuileries Palace to Versailles, which was a hunting lodge that his father used. And this was all in response to a political coup called the Fronde that happened when he was a child, where the nobility of France had effectively tried to make Louis a puppet king for them. The Louis XIII, Louis's father, had passed away, and his wife Anne was ruling as regent and was partnered up with a Cardinal Mazarin, who was who had kind of served in the same capacity that Cardinal Richelieu had to Louis XIII. So the Anne and Mazarin were very unpopular with the French nobility, so they tried to seize power and they stormed the Tuileries Palace and everything like that. And Louis XIV, who saw this as a young child, and it sowed an immense distrust between him and the nobility. And so rather than rely on advisors and everything the way that most of the previous monarchs had, Louis was in absolute control. Like, yes, he had advisors and everything like that, but he was the one making all the decisions. He was the one that was in charge of everything. He had created this state of absolute monarchy, and Versailles became a political tool to keep his nobility in check, forcing his nobility to move to Versailles, hosting these lavish parties, creating a social etiquette that kind of enslaved the nobility to a fashion of wanting to be close to the king. So this established a trend of absolute monarchy that went through, obviously, Louis XIV, who reigned very long, and then Louis XV, who was Louis XVI's grandfather, continued this trend. Now, Louis XVI was actually never supposed to be king. He was the second child of he was the second son, and so he was being raised with no real prep for the throne. He was receiving a pretty mundane education. Was learning things like he was really big into messing around with locks and building clocks, messing with gears and everything like that. He was very these very mundane tasks that were considered like fun things that children of the royal family would learn as little nice things to occupy their time, but he wasn't being educated in stately matters or anything like that. But then both his father and his older brother die. They get sick. And so now all of a sudden, this middle child who was never supposed to be on the throne is now the Dauphin, which is the title in French for the crown prince. Like, he is the guy that is supposed to succeed his grandfather, Louis XV. And Louis XV sees his grandson, and he's this, kind of quiet, introverted kid with not a lot of confidence. Hey, Aldous, we've got Aldous in the chat. If you want, you can come in and chat about this too. I'm sure that you have a lot of input on this subject. We're talking about Louis XVI. If you want a link, just let me know. I'll shoot it to you. So, but anyways, Louis comes in, and Louis ends up getting married to Marie Antoinette, who is a princess from Austria, who is a traditional enemy of France. So there's already a lot of tension there. They don't particularly click well from the offset, but there's a duty to preserve the throne, and a treaty with Austria will guarantee some peace. Doing this thing called work. Thanks for the offer, though. I appreciate that you're just listening. But anyways, so this marriage to Marie Antoinette is going to be a pretty big thing in terms of harming Louis's position. It's one of these grand ironies that Louis XVI's biggest motivation as a king is to be loved by his people, and he is married to quite possibly the most despised person in France at the time. Marie Antoinette is, as I said, the Austrians are a kind of traditional enemy of the French at this point in time. So there's already a great deal of disdain, but she's also kind of seen as this vapid socialite that's incredibly out of touch with reality, and the French people do not like her, and it certainly does not help that she is sleeping around, and this causes a lot of publicity problems for Louis, as well as there are libel pamphlets that are being printed out about why Louis can't perform with his wife, why she's sleeping around, why she's doing all this stuff. And that certainly doesn't help Louis out. But the big, as much of a problem as Marie Antoinette will prove to be, and she will prove to be a massive problem, especially as things get closer to both of their executions. One could even argue that the reason why the revolution goes down the path it does is a very unexpected bonding between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette towards the later part of their marriage before they end up dying. And he kind of starts letting her run the show, and that causes some pretty catastrophic events. But the biggest problem that Louis inherits from his grandfather is a financial crisis. France has spent pretty much the past century and a half in a nigh constant state of conflict. And under Louis XV, they were not only in a massive total war in the 7 Years' War, they lost a good deal of external revenue sources from their colonial holdings in the Americas, and they're in bad shape. So there is this push to try and fix the financial problems, and so there's the introduction of this character, Jacques Necker, who I talked a bit about last night. And Necker is a Swiss banker, and he ends up getting the royal family approved for several billion livres in bonds from banks across Europe. And this revenue is able to sustain the royal coffer for a very long time if managed properly. However, an opportunity I'm actually about to talk about that. Tree Goblin saying, "Did you know bankrupted itself funding the American Revolution?" That's what's going to end up happening. Is it in the 1775 and 1776 is when all this not Necker has gotten all these funds together, and then the American colonies begin their war of independence against Britain. And France becomes increasingly intrigued. But Louis XVI doesn't go in immediately. He is advised by many people to stay out of it. However, Louis XVI has this need to be loved by his people, and winning a war could change the public perception on him, especially against England. And so eventually, once the war starts to look like it's going in the favor of the American colonies, and it becomes something that's realistically achievable, Louis agrees to aid the Americans, and financing the French war effort and helping out and helping the American war effort with uniforms, supplies, everything like that. All of those expenses drain the loans that Necker had acquired for the royal court, and now they're stuck back where Louis XVI had started in his reign. They don't have money. They're bankrupt once more, and they need somebody to help them out. We are getting to that. So what ends up happening is there's a discussion on whether or not, on how to get the money, is either get more loans or increase taxes. Now, when it comes down to it, since Necker had gotten him these bonds from the banks in Europe, Louis was able to greatly reduce the taxing on the common people. With this, with the royal coffers now completely spent, now they're trying to implement taxes on the people again, and at an exorbitant rate at that matter. And the people of France are not having it. They start burning effigies of the finance minister, not Necker, but he had a follow-up. Necker's position in the royal court is off and on during this time. His background as a Swiss banker and a Protestant put him at frequent odds with prominent members in court, such as Marie Antoinette, because Necker would be constantly would be nagging at Louis XVI about reducing spending at court, toning down the expenses on the parties, and was trying to get the state solvent, and they weren't going to be able to do that if they kept blowing through the money at parties at Versailles, and Marie Antoinette did not like that. And so Necker found himself in and out of office on pretty much a rotation. He would come in for a bit, try to fix things, anger Marie Antoinette, and then she'd get him fired. And eventually what ends up happening is now it's 1789, and Necker is brought in one last time, and Marie Antoinette tries to have him hires a conspirator to frame him for effectively embezzling from the state. And so Necker is at this point this is the final straw, and he releases the Comte Rendu au Roi, which was effectively a finance report of the spending at Versailles. And in the midst of this economic crisis where the crown is trying to heavily tax the people of France because they're out of money, and there's a food shortage that's been started because of poor weather that affected the harvest in that year. People are livid. And this will directly result in Louis XVI calling up a problem-solving committee that hadn't been assembled in 150 years, the Estates General. But Louis XVI's need to be loved by everyone is going to effectively make the Estates General worthless. By this point in time, France has gone through a lot of change since the last time the Estates General has formed. It has gone through the Enlightenment. There's a lot of social virtue ethics that have been spread throughout the middle class and are starting to trickle down into the lower class in terms of equality and freedom. You also have the recent events of the American War of Independence. And so when Louis calls the Estates General, it's seen as a very grand opportunity. But the big problem with the Estates General is in how it functions, it's hardly equal. The way that the Estates General works is that there are 3 estates in France. You have the first estate, which is the clergy, the second estate, which is the aristocracy, and the third estate, which are the common people. Now, as you can expect, the first 2 estates make up maybe 15 to 20% of the population, with the third estate representing over 80, like the vast majority of the people in France. But the problem is that each one of these estates had the same voting power and same amount of representatives in assembly. So what is petitioned to Louis by Jacques Necker, who is instrumental in getting the Estates General to take place, is Necker tells Louis that he's going to need to reform this process. And fearing the repercussions of upsetting the nobility, while also wanting to appear to be a more reformed and enlightened monarch, Louis XVI agrees to edit to update the Estates General, but the update that he makes is ultimately worthless. What he ends up doing is he agrees that there needs to be more representation for the third estate, so he allows for an increase of representatives for the third estate. However, the voting power of each estate stayed the same. So effectively, if each estate had 1 vote, which is probably the simplest way to do this, is each estate, let's say that each estate has 1 vote, rather than giving the third estate 2, which is probably what should have been done, the third estate maintained that single vote. They had more representatives to argue their cases and everything like that, but at the end of the day, the third estate still had the same voting power as the other 2 estates. And this ended up being very problematic because while the Estates General were meeting, nothing was effectively being done to actually reform to make the reforms needed to repair the financial crisis. Any single time that the third estate would bring up a point that was seen as too radical by the first and second estate, they would get teamed up on and would end up losing out. And even though there were more moderate members in those first two estates that would frequently side with the third estate, such members are of note would be like the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a veteran of the American War of Independence and found himself in contact with Thomas Jefferson, and they were kind of kindred spirits. Eventually, the two will team up and write the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which will be kind of the French version of the Declaration of Independence, and will be a bulwark of the first Constitution. I believe, like the spiritual backbone of the first Constitution of France. So while you would have people like that would side with the third estate, it wasn't enough to make a difference. And so in their frustration, the third estate, Aldous is the foundation of the First Republic for sure. Yes, 100%. So what ends up happening is the third estate tells Louis that if the changes aren't made, they're going to form their own constitution without him. So Louis tries to prevent this from happening by barring the entrance of the Estates General and preventing the third estate from showing up. And the third estate responds by going to a nearby tennis court, which was open, and they swear an oath to not disband their convention until a new constitution is signed. Louis tries to kind of backpedal this a bit by urging members of the second and first estate to join the convention of the tennis court oaths after the fact, but by then the damage has been done. You have this kind of recurring theme of Louis trying to show some backbone during like the worst time to do it, and it ends up making things worse. And once the Estates General is over and we have the tennis court oaths and they're starting to build the Constitution, things in Paris are starting to get really bad. The cost of bread is skyrocketing due to the food shortages, and bread, while it seems a very like a novel, like a very mundane thing for us today, back then, especially, bread was kind of the backbone of the diet for the lower class. It was cheap, easily accessible, and it's filling. So when the cost of bread rose astronomically to the point where most people couldn't afford it, the women of Paris start to become angry. They're desperate. People, they're starving, and that's when you have political figures, most notably Maximilien Robespierre, will urge the women of Paris to band together and march on Versailles, which had been the home of the French nobility since, as I said at the beginning of the stream, Louis XIV, who had moved the royal presence from Paris to Versailles to gain some distance and independence, so that a fronde wouldn't happen again. Well, now there's a movement of 7,000 women marching from Paris to Versailles, and they're being joined along the way by armed citizens. The storming of the Bastille had happened shortly before this, I believe. Just to make sure that I've got the timeline right. The Women's Bread March was in October 5th of 1789. And I believe the storming of the Bastille was July 14th, 1789. So yes, the storming of the Bastille had already happened. Citizens had been armed. There were there was a new Citizens National Guard that were armed with the munitions that were gained from the Bastille. And so now this armed, rancorous crowd of people are marching on Versailles. They're storming. They're outside the gates, and the Marquis de Lafayette, who had been called upon to evacuate to help them, his National Guard soldiers defect to the crowd as well. And so the Marquis advises Louis XVI to come to Paris as a show of good faith. And the people escort him to Paris, and they bring him back in the Tuileries Palace. And this is kind of that turning point where, as I said, Hojo is in the chat. Hail, just finished up last night's replay. Nice work, guys. Thanks so much. I'm doing this because I felt like I didn't get the chance to really go in depth the way that I would have liked to on last night's stream. So I'm going to be actually doing French Revolution streams in the morning. I'm playing with the name a coffee in the salon to talk about the French Revolution. What ends up happening here is Louis, at this point, the writing's kind of on the wall. He's lost the control of everything. The new Constitution of France and the First Republic has gotten rid of the absolute monarchy that he held, and the attack on him in his own home and forcing him to move to the Tuileries Palace has showcased that he's completely failed in his goal of being the popular king. Fair enough. But so Louis has kind of failed in that goal, and so he starts listening more to his wife, Marie Antoinette. So Marie and Louis have several children at this point. It's for the most part not been the best marriage, but at this point, with their backs against the wall, they actually become very close. And Marie starts to make a lot of these decisions for Louis. And effectively, the plan becomes Marie Antoinette's brother is the Holy Roman Emperor in Austria. So the plan becomes that they are going to escape France to Austria and return with an Austrian army at their backs to reassert Louis's authority in France and regain the crown. This will end up being a massive incident that completely destroys the faith that Louis had, any remaining faith Louis had with the people. Up until this point, Louis had assured the people that he was in support of the new constitution, and he had even at one point adorned himself with the red cap of the revolution. And so by the public's eye, him giving his word that he had supported these things was as good as law. While the Enlightenment had happened, the middle class was primarily, who had taken a lot of that, would be labeled as the bourgeoisie. They were the ones that kind of dealt with the majority of the Enlightenment philosophies. And while some of those things had started to trickle down into the lower classes of what are known as the sans-culottes, those people are still beholden to a lot of the mentality of the ancien regime, of the old regime. And in that is the divinity of the crown. And so if a king gives his word on something, it's the same as God. And Louis had a massive reputation as a man of faith. Yeah, no, it's really bad. Like, if Marie Antoinette had not orchestrated the flight to Varennes, the entire history of the revolution would have been different. Like, yeah, absolutely. Like, and that's really what it comes down to, is this decision to leave is the worst thing that could possibly happen, because what ends up happening is, as I said, Louis had what I wanted to finish with that point before I go into this is Louis had spent a great deal of his time going to local churches in the countryside. He was actually outside of the city of Paris. Louis was actually very popular, especially in the rural regions of France, because he would frequently visit local churches and everything. He never really fit in with the aristocracy. But so he would hang out with the people that treated him like a king. And those were the common folk. And so this relationship even plays into why he thinks that he's going to be able to get away with the flight to Varennes, is he believes that Paris is a vacuum. The people of Paris are the ones that don't want him on the throne. France as a whole loves him. And the people of the country will not only be fine with him leaving and coming back with this foreign army, they will help him do it. And this proves to be incredibly wrong. So while all of while everything's going on between 1789 and 1791, which is when the flight to Varennes happens, Marie Antoinette is in contact with her brother, and they coordinate an escape plan. The Austrians have sent a cavalry escort to meet Louis at Varennes and take them across the French border into Austria. And so Louis and Marie Antoinette and their children, they sneak out of the Tuileries Palace. While it is currently guarded by the Marquis de Lafayette, there is, if you ask people like Maximilien Robespierre, Lafayette was completely in on the plot. Whether or not he actually was is kind of up to academic debate. I think that while Lafayette was a revolutionary mind, I do think he was a bit more moderate. He definitely wanted more of a constitutional monarchy. Certain members of the Jacobin Club will accuse him of wanting to impose a military dictatorship, where they rule through. He would be at the command of a French army and would rule through Louis as a puppet king. Like, there's a lot of things that are spread about Lafayette by Robespierre and Jean-Paul Marat. He was another key figure of the revolution. So the extent at which Lafayette is involved with the flight is up for speculation, is the point. Louis XVI and his family, they leave Paris at like 4 a.m, dead of night, and they're supposed to meet the Austrian cavalry by X time. But every few hours, the royal family stops their carriages, pulls over, and has a meal, or does like a country road trip photo opportunity would be like the equivalent. They're constantly stopping to chat with the peasants. And of course, in these interactions, he gets recognized. And in fact, one person asks him for his identification, and he gives them like a fake passport, but the guy's got the French currency, which has Louis' face on it. And so word makes it back to Paris that the king has escaped. And the Parisian National Guard mobilizes, and they chase after Louis. And by the time Louis gets to the rendezvous point where the Austrian cavalry are waiting for him, they have been there for hours. And they have stripped their horses from their saddles and everything like that, because if a horse is in that for too long, it'll tire out and break from the pressure. So they're patting down their horses. They're giving them the time to recover. And the king arrives, and right in their tail comes the National Guard of Paris, who have caught up. And there's a skirmish between Austrian cavalry and the Parisian National Guard, and the Austrian cavalry are forced to retreat and leave the royal family there. And the flight to Varennes is really the tipping point. This is where you have voices that have been critical of maintaining the monarchy since the Estates General, people like Robespierre specifically, who now are getting a way more validity. And over the next few months, things start to get worse. The impact of the flight to Varennes shook the confidence in the king so much that riots became more aggressive and targeted. Lafayette was accused of being a part of it, and so a riot broke out, and they were throwing stones at Lafayette and his National Guard units, and they opened fire in what's called the Champ de Mars massacre. And this, very similar to what happens in the Boston Massacre in American War of Independence, this really is the powder keg. And so Louis brings in a royal bodyguard of Swiss guardsmen to protect him and his family in the Tuileries Palace, which in his trial he says was his right to do, and he saw it as a necessity, which I actually do believe at this point in time. It's very clear that people want his blood, want blood. They're really, really not happy. He's now being called the Janus King. So hold on. I'll just put out some stuff. If he was aware that that would have been a philosophically Gordian knot for him to work through. All his high ideals contrasted against his very Frenchness. Absolutely. So that's the what ends up happening is when he brings in the Swiss Guard, the Parisian National Guard units and the Sans-Culottes band together under Georges Danton, who will become a prominent figure in the formation of the Committee of Public Safety, along with Maximilien Robespierre, Jean-Paul Marat, and Camille Desmoulins. They end up storming the Tuileries Palace. They kill the Swiss guardsmen, and the royal family flees to the Convention House to try and get amnesty. The convention turns them over, and Louis is stripped of his position as king, stripped of his Bourbon heraldry and namesake, and is put on trial as citizen Louis Capet. Now, the trial of Louis XVI is a really interesting topic. And to that point, there were even Robespierre was completely against having him tried at all. At this point in time, Robespierre was pretty much like, if we put him on trial and he goes innocent, we're all doomed. He wanted Louis to just be immediately put to death. And interestingly enough, Jean-Paul Marat actually voiced a dissenting opinion where he wanted Louis because of how important it was to maintain the virtues of the revolution. They had to put him on trial. Louis does go to trial, and he's found guilty of everything. There's an incredible amount of evidence that comes forward, including very condemning letters between Marie Antoinette and her brother that come out, and Louis's involvement in them. There's also the whole thing of, while all this has been going on since the flights of Varennes, Louis has been working with the president of the convention, and effectively what is brought against him is he's been fanning the president of the convention's desire to go to war with Austria so that the Austrians can beat the French and reinstate him to the throne. And so this is put against him as a counter-revolutionary plot. And so all this evidence comes out, and Louis has quite possibly the best legal team that you could even imagine defending him. And even Robespierre acknowledged their aptitude, because they put on a hell of a case, where even with the cross-examination of Louis XVI, which is horrifyingly incriminating, where he just comes off, at best he comes off as inept, at worst he straight up just lies and contradicts himself on the stand. So what ends up happening is the vote is held on whether or not he is guilty of his crimes of against the revolutionary government of France and the French people, and it's unanimous. He's guilty. But where the debate comes in is, how should he be punished? Now, in part due to the excellent legal defense that his lawyers had put up, and in part due to moderate factions that were sympathetic to the crown, there was a prominent push to exile Louis XVI to the Americas, where he would live, where he would be given kind of an allowance, and he could just live out his days pursuing his hobbies of locksmithing and clockwork and what have you. These are things that he had been educated in as a child, and he had maintained throughout his adulthood. They were not considered princely pursuits, but he was far more mundane than most royalty. And the big, imagine being present and watching the king be completely humbled by his own words, pretty much. It's there is actually a transcript of the trial, and if people are interested, I can get the link to it and put it in the description. It is horrifying. A few months ago, people were watching, the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, and Amber Heard's cross-examination. People were just dropping their jaws at how bad her responses are. And as bad as her responses are, they do not hold a candle to how Louis XVI comes off in his cross-examination by the Constitutional Convention. He just comes up it's horrifying. And the fact that it was as close as a vote as it was for his execution really showcases how good his lawyers were. They definitely did quite the job in defending him. But ultimately, the vote, to Max's point, it would be interesting if the return of the monarchy following Napoleon's first exile would have held if the public had not Yeah, absolutely. I think that if those testimonies hadn't been there, and people saw just how damning the evidence was against Louis XVI, the monarchy might have had a bit more support. It also didn't help the return of the monarchy that what's his name? The Bourbon that was returned to the throne completely reverted back to the old habits of parties in the palace and everything like that. It had to have a cascading effect of shattering the last vestiges of tradition. Absolutely. And like so Louis, the trial, everyone agrees that he's guilty. There's a strong push to have him exiled to America, but what it ultimately comes down to is the vote to execute comes down to a single vote in favor of execution. And so in January of 1793, Louis XVI is led to the guillotine, and just how he was in life as this guy who just wanted to be liked by everyone. He doesn't give a speech that, defends his position. He doesn't give a speech that tries to decry or incriminate the people of France and their role. He simply states that he is innocent, but he's made peace with it, and he only hopes that his death will give the people of France happiness, which, like it kind of really captures who he is as a person. He was always somebody that just wanted to be liked by everybody, and it was that very notion that allowed for all of this to happen in the first place. And ironically, the one time he didn't go with that was when he was listening to his wife, and his wife made the situation so much worse. But Louis XVI ends up dying at the guillotine, and his death really cements the beginnings of the Reign of Terror. Most historians will categorize the Reign of Terror beginning in 1792 during what is called the September Massacres, and I would definitely agree with that. However, it really goes into effect once Louis XVI is dead, because then you have the formation of the Committee of Public Safety, and they almost immediately start going after people. They round up 78 Girondist politicians from the convention, and they execute them within a matter of like a month or two after. I think the execution of the arrest and execution of the Girondist happens in either March or May of 1793. Like it's really swift. There's not a lot of time between the king's execution to the formation of the Committee of Public Safety and the immediate pursuance of these supposed enemy of the states and counter-revolutionary aristocrats. So that is really the kind of foundation of everything. Is that at the end of the day, the French Revolution was a result of a man who was never fit to be king being put in a position of absolute authority when he didn't have the ability or constitution to wield his absolute authority. It's very interesting because the French Revolution, a lot of people argue, is completely fruitless because it begins with a king, the overthrowing of a king, and ends with the rise of an emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. And Bonaparte, as emperor, is a very controversial figure, where you have some people that argue that Napoleon betrays the ideas of the revolution by reinstating the monarchy and everything like that, by making himself emperor. But then you have others that will argue that Napoleon embodied the true ideals of what the revolution was supposed to be at the beginning, and he leaves behind a lot of the negative stuff that the revolution took and ran with the Reign of Terror under the Robespierres, and Napoleon does, yes, he reinstitutes a pseudo-monarchical style system, but there's still a constitutional government, and there are more rights of equity between citizens and everything like that. And so it would have been like, what I think is interesting is, had Louis's older brother not died, had it been, I am not going to talk shit about Napoleon. I love Napoleon, and I will eventually do a whole thing on him, because Napoleon is a fascinating. We will do a show all this. We'll get it sorted. Napoleon is a fascinating topic, but I think that the very success of Napoleon reinforces the idea that if another man had been the king of France at the beginning of this, if somebody that had been groomed to the throne, the French Revolution probably wouldn't have happened, or it would have been very different. Because the very root of the problem was this man was brought up with these enlightened ideals of trying to bend the knee to everybody, but he was also in a position of absolute authority. And he had not had the proper grooming to be the king. And he was put in that position at a young age, and he was constantly making the wrong calls. And while there were moments where things could have been altered or pushed one way or another, this need and desire to be loved by everybody was the thing that undid Louis XVI. And ultimately, as a king, you need to accept that your authority is the authority. And that's going to piss some people off, and that's going to make some people happy. But your decisions are your decisions. And Louis never wanted to be held accountable for his decisions. He was always trying to make a decision that would make everyone happy for him. And that lack of ability to be efficient with his decision making and put down his foot on it is what led to the fall of the Bourbon monarchy. That being said, we are at an hour. I think that this was a really good stream. If you guys did like this and want me to continue doing these videos, feel free to let me know. If that's the case, then I'll try and do another one next Thursday at around the same time, around like 10 a.m. or so. But last night when we did the stream, I was happy with how it started, and then I kind of got sidetracked, and I was trying to balance engaging with the chat and telling the story, and I felt like I kind of botched both. So I figured doing a stream like this in the morning where I can just kind of talk, and then like if some people come in and watch live, I'm able to engage with them. That's awesome. And then otherwise it'll be mostly for replay value, I'm imagining. But I hope everyone enjoyed. And to close out this Louis XVI stream, I think I've got the perfect little clip. So